Europe and Germany continue to move fast on rearmament. Canada has a new prime minister and a growing trade war, and Vladimir Putin has weighed in on President Trump's peace deal for Ukraine. We're going to look at all this and more on today's Trumpet World. Hello and welcome back to Trumpet World. I'm still here in Canada, where it is minus 10 degrees outside, way too cold for outside recording. So we've got this slightly different setup where we're each just going to record our own individual segments and stitch it together as a video for you. I'll be back in the regular studio next week with our regular format. Well, there have been so many stories about European rearmament. This is a subject that is moving fast. It's a really big, really important story to watch. It is the cover story of our latest Trumpet print magazine that just went up on the website this week. I'd really encourage you to go and check that out. But I have so many bits and pieces to update you about on this story. We're going to talk about President Trump's push for a peace deal with Ukraine later. But one ramification that hit Europe starting with last weekend is his decision to stop military and intelligence aid for Ukraine. Now, I think that aid has now been restored, but he did things like shut off support for F-16 radar jammers. And this has kind of freaked Europe out. It's made them realize that if they're depending on American weapons, they're depending on America. And so this has turbocharged that already present push to build up a European defense industry and to buy and build European weapons instead of American weapons. So stories went around the German media over the weekend that the F-35 has a kill switch, that America can turn that plane off anytime it likes. I don't know whether that's true, but certainly what we've seen with the military aid to Ukraine shows how that there are key elements of these weapon systems that America can turn off. And so many of them are dependent on software updates and ongoing software support. The F-35 is a tremendously complicated aircraft that, yeah, if you are buying these weapons from the United States, there are things America can do to pull the plug from you. And in some ways, it is good that America is not trusting Europe with some of these advanced weapon systems. I mean, we warn on this show about America trusting in Europe, but this understanding now is prompting Europe to think much more seriously about building its own defense industry. It already has a very credible defense industry, and so they're going to be looking at churning out more of their own material and being less reliant on the United States. It's another aspect of their break with the United States. Then also European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. She has made Buy European a major part of her push now for this European debt deal that will allow all of Europe to spend more on their military, make it easier for nations to borrow money, so that she wants to really incentivize European countries to buy European and for European companies and countries to work together to develop Europe-wide weapon systems so they can compete with the major American giants. Then also this idea that the United States is no longer going to protect Europe from Russia, and the way we're seeing that play out in Ukraine is also turbocharging changes in Eastern Europe. So Poland, we've talked about Poland for months, maybe going a couple of years now on this show, that they are undergoing a massive rearmament. They've more than doubled their defense spending. They're buying hundreds of tanks. They're looking at, I think they're already right around 5% of their economy going into defense. Well, right around last weekend and shortly before that, we got a whole range of stories from Eastern Europe. So Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk talked about giving all adult men military training. They want to increase the Polish army from 200,000 to 500,000 soldiers. There's been a lot of talk about Poland getting nuclear weapons, which I'll come back to. But just to finish up Eastern Europe, you've got Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're all in various stages of leaving or seriously considering leaving the Ottawa Treaty that bans anti-personnel mines. Lithuania has announced that it has withdrawn from the Oslo Convention that bans cluster munitions. So these countries are all looking at getting weapons that they once ruled out using and signed treaties saying that they would never use. It's understandable, but it's also a symptom of how fearful these countries are and that we're moving into a new era where they're not willing to deny themselves use of certain weapons. And then nuclear weapons. There's some divides in Polish politics, but on this issue of rearmament, all sides of the political spectrum are right on board with this. So the President Andrzej Duda, he gave an interview to the Financial Times on Wednesday where he asked the US to station nuclear weapons in its territory. This is in the backdrop of Germany and France talking more and more seriously about sharing nuclear weapons. And Duda is from a wing of Polish politics that would rather rely on the United States than on Germany. The Prime Minister Donald Tusk is on more of the pro-German wing. And so this may well be Duda trying to kind of forestall a push from the Tusk faction to be part of this Franco-German nuclear kind of union that they're talking about. But nuclear weapons are becoming a big deal in Europe, a very real prospect of more nuclear sharing. It's a topic now of everyday conversation. You see newspaper articles about Europe and nuclear weapons every few days. And all of this is really turbocharging Europe's push for unity. I played the clip on last week's show from Herbert W. Armstrong, where he talked about how fear of what's going on in the Kremlin and in the Soviet Union as it was back then, one of the great things that is urging Europe on, and perhaps the greatest thing that will cause them to hurry and get together on this. Russia is prompting major changes in Europe. He also said they're losing confidence in the United States as having a military umbrella over them to protect them, and they want their own military force to protect themselves. That is what we're seeing, and it seems very likely that Poland will play a major role in that as part of the eastern leg of this growing European power. And Mr. Fleury has also drawn a whole lot of attention to Europe's use of America's nuclear weapons and where it's leading. Now they're looking at having a greater role for nuclear weapons. Here is what Mr. Fleury said in a Key of David about this shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
And Germany is now asking America for some jets that can haul the nuclear bombs that America has given them. Just given them to them. Even though Germany never did pay their full share of NATO, they never have. And they're a very wealthy country. But is this the right thing we're doing in giving them our nuclear bombs? Are they our friend? And we've been prophesying for over 75 years that they are not going to be our friends in this last Holy Roman Empire. And yet, how many people understand that? But now we're upgrading the B-61 bombs stationed in Germany. Where is it all leading? Now they're getting the jets from the U.S. to be able to transport those bombs. But here, when you think about Germany and the people of Germany today, they don't think much of America. One of the top leaders talked years ago, and still does, about how he has had utter contempt for Donald Trump. The German people agreed with him. And now it's just as bad with Mr. Biden. So where is it all leading? Where is it taking us?
Everything that Mr. Fleury talked about then, you're seeing happening with more urgency today. Europe is more urgent about nuclear bombs and what they can do to Europe, and he talked about the contempt across Europe for Donald Trump. Well, you see that far more now than you did 2 years ago. It's a really open contempt. Now, Poland doesn't have quite that same level of contempt, say, that you see in Germany and France, but really they are working with and empowering Germany, at least the Prime Minister Donald Tusk's faction. And this is the power that's rising in Europe, a power with nuclear weapons and a contempt for the United States of America. Another really important story that I wanted to update you on is this German constitutional change. So I'm sure you remember that Germany is changing its constitution to introduce some massive changes to its military. It wants to exempt military spending from its limits on borrowing so that it can borrow an unlimited amount of money if that money is going to military spending. And this week, that hit a major roadblock and then cleared it almost immediately. And Europe has their own plan as well to exempt military spending from borrowing rules. And again, some of this hit a major roadblock and then cleared almost right away. And that shows the amount of real urgency that is going on behind these different deals. So for Germany to change their constitution, they need a 2/3 majority. They want to do it in the outgoing parliament, not the parliament that is about to start sitting, that has just got it voted in. That's a very undemocratic thing to do, but it's the only way they believe they can get this in place. And they need the support of the Green Party to have that 2/3 majority. And the Green Party began this week saying, nope, no way. We don't think this is a legitimate way of doing things. We want to make the new parliament, the incoming parliament, sign off on this. That's the only democratic way of doing this. We're not going to support it. And at least according to reports that we've been getting today out of Reuters, they've done a deal. And they've basically been bought off. And it looks like the coalition has said, okay, Greens, we'll give you $100 billion of environmental spending. And if we agree to do that, then will you support this? And it seems like they have said yes. There are still some other roadblocks. There's a coalition partner, a junior coalition partner of Bavaria's state government that could make this difficult in the upper chamber of Germany's parliament. And they really don't have much time to get this through because the new parliament will start sitting in just a few days. But I think you really see them powering through every obstacle. You saw this on Europe as well. So Ursula von der Leyen has her plan to allow Europe to spend more. And the Netherlands said that they would vote against it. So 3 out of the 4 Dutch coalition partners voted against it in the Dutch parliament. This wasn't enough to kill the deal. It can still go ahead. It doesn't require unanimity. But it does really limit what Europe can do on defense because bigger changes on defense would require unanimity. So it was a signal that the Netherlands would stand in the way of anything that meant more military spending. But they wouldn't stand in the way for very long. The Dutch Prime Minister, who was kind of this technocratic figurehead, banged some heads together in the coalition and they backed down. They gave way. They said, we're going to support this. Again, now signaling, well, that Europe might be able to be more ambitious on the defense spending that they want. I mean, this is obstacles that sprang up and then dissolved so fast. There is real will and real urgency, a real push behind what is happening in Europe. I mean, watch for these major military changes. Now, these roadblocks do point to the fact that Europe does need a strong leader. And to really get a lot of the changes that they want, I think they will still need a strong leader to kind of blast through these obstacles. This is what Mr. Fleury wrote in the latest Trumpet print edition. He said, Germany has been plagued by weak leadership for many years now. But Germany and Europe really need strong leadership, especially given what Russia is doing, as well as China, North Korea, and other nations, and the many economic and other problems they are facing. And some of these roadblocks do point to that strong leadership. But they're so urgent to get these through, you can absolutely see a lot of these bureaucrats and everyone else getting behind a strong leader. Getting behind somebody that will override some of these democratic niceties. Because they really want Europe to be this independent power that can stand up to the United States of America. Just one more quick story on this military front. Again, just been so many of these. Volkswagen. Volkswagen have been struggling to keep their factories open. They announced, hey, we'd be open to building German military equipment instead of building cars. The CEO, Oliver Blume, he said, if there was the option of military vehicles going forward, we would have to look at the concepts. But he said, we did that in the past. Volkswagen Group has automotive competence. So Volkswagen is really struggling. They've had their emissions scandal. Demand for cars are down. They're struggling. The whole German auto industry is struggling with this shift to electric vehicles where European law and other law around the world is trying to push people to buy electric vehicles. And German auto industry just isn't at the cutting edge of electric vehicles. So they're struggling, and this may well provide a way out. And we're seeing this now across several different factories. This could really accelerate Germany's already formidable defense industry just becoming even more powerful. Joshua Michels had a brief write-up on this on our website, and he made the point that this isn't new for Volkswagen. That they were set up, of course, by Adolf Hitler in 1933 to make their people's car, the Volkswagen, and just a few years later, they started switching from making cars to making military vehicles. And then another quick story that Joshua drew attention to. We had some data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute this week that compared arms imports from 2015 to 2019 in Europe to European arms imports from 2020 to 2024. And they found they'd basically doubled. That is an important thing to bear in mind, that European arms import, manufacture, all of this has been increasing for years. And what we're seeing now is a much more rapid increase, but it's coming on the back of something that has already turned around. So keep watching this trend. And our Trumpet print edition, Europe Up in Arms, is a great place to go to get all the most important stories on that. Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry has an article in there about the rise of a European strongman and looking at the latest political developments in Germany. I have something in there that brings you up to speed on Germany's military turnaround and all of Europe's military turnaround. This is a prophecy that Herbert W. Armstrong talked about for years, and we've played a lot of those clips for you on that show where he said, watch for Europe, watch for Germany to rebuild. He was right there in Germany shortly after it was rubble and watching it be rebuilt quickly and saying, well, they're going to become a major military power. And that is what we're seeing now. And a lot in the United States, they're either not paying attention or they're cheering. But Bible prophecy sounds a really clear warning on this. And I think part of the reason people aren't alive to the possibility or the certainty of what is happening in Europe is they have too much of a benign view of human nature and see human beings as basically good. They underestimate the great capacity for evil that is there. And that's one of the big things God is raising this power up to teach us. Here's another clip from Mr. Flurry's Key of David show shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine on the rearmament that Germany was doing back then.
But here we have the best news you could possibly hear, and all of these people are being prepared and trained to rule. And surely we can see the need for rulers on this earth. We have so many pathetic rulers that are simply not qualified to rule. And they're monsters, they're beasts when they have all that power. They're not fit to take that power and rule. God has tried to teach man that from the very beginning. And before this is all over, people who've lived and never known God are going to be resurrected, and every person who's ever lived is going to have an opportunity to get to know God and live the way they should be living.
I mean, we need to see that man is not qualified to rule man. And God is training a new government. But that new government's only going to rule once they've been born into God's family by the resurrection from the dead at Jesus Christ's return. And the only government that can bring peace is God's government. And trusting in man can never work. And people are way too trusting in man. They're way too trusting in European leaders. They're way too trusting in their own leaders. And unless we turn to God and repent and start looking to Him for leadership, it is all going to turn to disaster. But really, I mean, this urgent rise of what is happening in Europe, there's some danger there, but it is really exciting because of that truth that Mr. Flurry focused on in that clip. It's leading up to the return of Jesus Christ and a new world that does away with this militarism that has just been a repeated curse for the world. Well, a couple of other quick stories I wanted to hit on. Portugal's government fell this week. We've seen so many divided governments in Europe, so many complicated, wobbly coalitions that can barely keep it together. So they fell apart. The prime minister has been in all kinds of accusations of conflict of interest because of his family's law firm. So they're going to be holding elections in May. I mean, watch for this kind of story to also push for all of Europe to get behind a German strongman as they kind of have dysfunctional government, but they're trying to deal with the threat of Russia and economic problems and migration and all of this. They're just going to push for a strongman to sort it all out. And you're seeing this kind of trend happen already. J.D. Vance, to his credit, drew attention to this while he was in Europe, where Romania previously annulled its November election result. And they've now said that the winner, Kalin Georgescu, he can't run, and they've been arresting him. So he's not going to be able to run in the upcoming elections in May, where they're redoing that. And this is something that we see so often from Europe, but it's becoming more and more flagrant. Hey, you got the answer wrong. Do the election again. They did that for a lot of European treaties and referendums. Now in Romania, they're doing it for a national government. Fraser Myers had a good article at Spiked Online where he wrote, "This anti-democratic coup in Romania speaks to a broader worrying trend. Establishment national parties in Europe and the European Commission in Brussels have found plenty of ways to ride roughshod over the wishes of voters." Then he said a little further down, "Romania's turn against democracy is yet more proof that the real threat to democracy in Europe comes not from anti-establishment outsiders, but from the centrist technocratic elites and their backers in Brussels. Europe is already turning against democracy, turning against values that Britain and America have espoused for years. What is rising up, this military power in Europe that is rising up, is not a friend of Britain and America. And God is allowing it to punish us, to turn us to him, to help us realize that we cannot trust in human minds." Well, that is about it for the Europe section. Again, I'd really encourage you to go and look at that latest Trumpet print edition, Up in Arms. You can get that on our website, thetrumpet.com. If you want to be able to read those magazines without any prompting from me, you can sign up. You can get your own free subscription. We'll post it out to you. It comes out about 5 times a year. It is always free. There's no request for money, for donations. There's no pressuring you. There's no other follow-up. The only thing that we do is after about 6 months, we just send you a card saying, "Hey, do you still want to keep receiving this?" We don't want to be sending it out to you if you don't want it. But as long as you keep sending those cards back, we keep sending you that magazine for free. It's not a trial introductory offer or anything like that. We'd be really happy to send that to you, and you can order that at our website, thetrumpet.com. Well, we'll shift gears to talk a little more about a story that closely relates to where I am in Canada now, trade wars. These are taking off, and Andrew Miiller has more on that. After him, we'll hear from Jeremiah Jacques about Russia's response to President Trump's Ukraine deal. And then we'll hear from Mihailo Zekic about a new relationship building between Israel and Lebanon and a great danger that is building there. So we'll take a brief break, and we'll go now to Andrew Miiller.
The trade war between the United States and Canada is escalating. This week, Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to raise the price of electricity on a number of U.S. cities that get their electricity from Canada. And in retaliation, Donald Trump temporarily raised tariffs on imports of Canadian metals, such as aluminum and iron, by up to 50%. He stepped that down after the Canadians stepped that down, but it looks like this building trade war is something that's going to be around for a while. In other related news, Canada's actually now knows who its next prime minister is going to be. Justin Trudeau announced on January 6th that he was stepping down, so the Liberal Party finally had a vote, and 151,000 Canadian Liberals voted with an 86% majority to make Mark Carney the next Prime Minister of Canada. Actually, Mr. Palmer and our Canadian correspondent, Mr. Abraham Blondeau, did a really good program on our Wednesday show about the Canadian economy more general and whether or not Mark Carney can fix it. Though on this Week in Review program, I did want to focus more on just what Mark Carney means for the trade war between the U.S. and Canada, in that his number one issue for his campaign is running as the only one tough enough to stand up against Trump for the trade war. And so he definitely is saying that, he said, until Trump repeals the tariffs on Canada, that the retaliatory tariffs on the United States are going to continue. There's not going to be much rapprochement between the two sides as long as Carney's in office. I find this topic really fascinating just from the standpoint of the global trade war, because Carney is actually only the second prime minister in Canadian history to be made prime minister without holding a parliament seat. He's not a politician. He's never run in an election before. He ran the Bank of Canada. He ran the Bank of Britain for a while. He was Mario Draghi's replacement at the Financial Stability Board, but his whole career has been built in finance. So his just kind of coming out of nowhere to be Prime Minister of Canada, it really reminds me of what happened in Italy a few years ago when the Italians voted for a candidate that the European Union didn't like. And so the European Union basically installed Mario Draghi as like a technocratic governor for a short period in time in order to keep Italy in line with the European Union. It seems like a similar thing is happening here in Canada. Carney is also big into finance. He worked closely with Mario Draghi on the Financial Stability Report. He was really a major force working against Brexit and the European Union. And it now looks like a number of like the powerful financial elites in Europe and in Canada have really kind of pulled some strings to get Carney installed into an office that he wasn't voted to take hold of. They will likely have elections in Canada sometime this year, so we'll see how long he lasts. But this is definitely a move in order to keep Canada as like part of the global economic system, which Trump is trying to withdraw from, and by making America more self-sufficient. It was actually one of Carney's colleagues in the Canadian Liberal Party was even talking about how there needs to be a new world order against Trump. And so that really seems to be what we're looking at here, is Canada trying to draw closer to the European Union in response to Trump's trade wars. If you actually read Carney's book, Values, it cites Pope Francis as its central inspiration and really talks about values, the values of a Catholic social doctrine. A doctrine which believes that the world should avoid the totalitarian extremes of communism just as much as it avoids American ideals of free market capitalism, and kind of chart what they call a third way, where you've got government elites like Draghi and Carney who are regulating private businesses heavily so that private industry can still exist, but it's governed by what basically amounts to a neo-feudal aristocracy of bankers and governors and other officials like that. So fascinating topic, watching how this is all going to play out in Canada. We know from Bible prophecy that there's Revelation 18 talks about this worldwide economic power where the merchants of the earth trade with all sorts of different nations under the overall guidance of the Catholic Church. And so Pope Francis has been really fulfilling this prophecy like few popes in modern history, with his ecumenicals against free market capitalism, against the United States in particular, trying to draw the nations of Europe and Asia and Latin America into what basically amounts to an anti-American economic alliance. Our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Fleury, has written extensively before about Europe's attempts to integrate with the Mercosur alliance in Latin America to besiege the United States. And this effort to get Carney to promote Catholic social doctrine and other doctrines like this in Canada is really part of that same trend. I even had a friend mention to me recently that it thought it could almost be like a pincher movement, where if you've got Latin America integrated into the European system, in Canada integrated into the European system, if Trump's trying to make America independent and self-sufficient of that system, that European system has them surrounded on all sides. And so to that effect, even though Trump's tariffs are hurting America's standard of living and hurting Canada's standard of living even more, it is possibly a necessary trial run to make sure that America is ready for a prolonged trade war. We're already finding out things that, like, well, the Canadians threatened to turn off the electricity so that we know that, like, okay, well, our electric grid has problems. There's a vulnerability that we couldn't survive a trade war. We need to fix that. We do know, and I made this point in an article I wrote last week on the Great North American Trade War Begins, that Bible prophecy indicates that you've got this European system that besieges the Anglo-Saxon nations. Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong and Mr. Gerald Fleury have taught for years that they thought the Latin American countries would be part of that European system, but Canada, being a fellow English-speaking Anglo-Saxon nation, likely won't be. Mr. Armstrong predicted for years that Britain would leave the European Union because Bible prophecy doesn't say that Britain would be conquered economically. It said it would be conquered militarily. And I think you can really make a similar case with Canada. They're not going to be conquered economically by this European system. They're going to be conquered militarily. Under Trudeau and Carney, it seems like they're definitely going along with the economic conquest. Although by the next year or two, we could probably expect a pretty dramatic reversal there as Canada does align more with the American system of doing things, and the two nations together in North America stand against this rising Holy Roman Empire that's espousing Catholic policies that are being put forward by Pope Francis and his likely successor here in the near future, since the Pope's in rather poor health right now. As to other news in the Anglo-American region, Donald Trump is making good progress on his promise to downsize the deep state. He did promise to abolish the Department of Education. That is going to take an act of Congress to completely abolish. But in the meantime, working together with Elon Musk, he has decided to fire half of the people who work there. So the Department of Education is only going to be half the size it used to be. Although, sadly, with all the progress Dodge is making, Congress hasn't really followed up with taking these savings to make progress towards paying off our national debt, which is a huge security. I just got a report this morning that the national debt has increased $1.1 trillion just in the first 5 months of this year, which means that it's increasing at a record-breaking pace. It's never increased this fast in such a short space of time, largely driven by rising interest rates on the national debt, increases in defense spending, and increases on border security. These are things the Trump administration has all increased in anticipation of some big cuts to wasteful bureaucracy. Yet so far, Doge hasn't made enough cuts to offset that. The national debt really is America's Achilles heel. Strongest military power on the earth, biggest economy on the earth, and still looking at bankruptcy in the next decade or so if there's not a dramatic reduction in these $2 trillion deficits that the government keeps running. And then one final story, the United States and Canada are not the only parts of Anglo-America. Britain, Australia, and New Zealand are English-speaking nations as well. And especially in Australia, having some problems this week with China. Newsweek just published a map of Chinese military, particularly Chinese naval moves in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, showing that their ship movements really have the Australian continent completely surrounded in a way that's really getting some policymakers in Australia concerned. They're trying to make more defense deals with some of the other islands in the oceanic region, realizing that just like the European Union is taking over Latin America and trying to move into Canada to besiege the United States, China's moving in through islands across the Pacific and Indian Oceans in an attempt to besiege Australia.
The big story from Asia is that Russia is uneasy with the ceasefire deal that U.S. President Donald Trump hashed out with the Ukrainian leadership this week. President Putin issued a statement about this on Thursday. He said the idea of a 30-day ceasefire sounds good in some ways, but that he's not sure about some aspects of the deal, especially what it would mean for Ukrainian soldiers who are in Kursk. That's the part of Russia that the Ukrainians pushed into last August in a surprise offensive, and Putin has been unable to push them out. So this is part of the deal that he is sort of unsure about. And he said, quote, "If we stop the hostilities for 30 days, what does it mean? Does it mean that everyone who's there in Kursk will leave without a fight? Or the Ukrainian leadership will give them an order to lay down their arms and just surrender? How will it be? It is not clear." End quote. And then Putin also said that he won't sign anything unless he gets guarantees that during those 30 days, the Ukrainians will not use the time to regroup and rebuild their forces. Now, he didn't offer any promises that Russia would not regroup and rebuild their forces during those 30 days, but he wants someone to promise him, apparently in a verifiable way, that Ukrainian forces definitely will not do that. And then earlier on Thursday, Russia's officials said that they would need other requirements before they would agree to the ceasefire as well. And it was really the same list of maximalist demands that the Russians have often discussed: total Ukrainian surrender, elimination of the Ukrainian military, Ukraine cut off from Western aid, Ukraine letting Russia have essentially a foothold on the Dnipro River's west bank so that it can stage a new offensive deep into Ukraine's heartland soon, and getting rid of Ukraine's elected leadership as well, so that Russia could be free to install basically a collaborationist regime. So these are pretty outlandish demands from Russia, and maybe we are supposed to consider some of those earlier demands nullified by Putin's later statement, the statement that came later in the day, but he didn't specifically say that he's backing off on those earlier demands. So it seems like even though Putin is giving some lip service to the ceasefire deal, when you look at his conditions, it seems that he's not really going for it. So the big question now is, what will U.S. President Donald Trump do? You know, after announcing this deal, Mr. Trump said the ball was in Putin's court. But now with Putin issuing these contingencies and provisos, that ball seems to be back in Mr. Trump's court once again. And we'll have to see how Mr. Trump responds to Putin. He really seemed to bend over backwards to please Putin. He also promised his constituents here in the U.S. that he would end the war in 24 hours. So he may be getting frustrated with Putin's pretty tepid response to this ceasefire deal. But this is also an interesting indication that we've just gotten from Putin that Russia may not be in a great position right now. You know, you would think that Russia would relish a chance to have 30 days to regroup and rebuild their forces, and then they could get back to killing and destroying with renewed vigor. But instead, it seems Putin views that as less advantageous than whatever the Ukrainians could gain by building their forces up for those same 30 days. And Russia doesn't want to give them that time. And it has been truly remarkable to see the European Union, ever since President Trump seemed to be trying to appease Russia more, the EU started backing Ukraine far more meaningfully. And they're now taking funds from Russian assets that have been seized, and they're pumping all those funds into Ukraine. And this is billions and billions of dollars worth of new weaponry. So Russia appears to be nervous about all of that European aid materializing on the battlefields in the next few weeks. So we don't yet know what Mr. Putin or Mr. Trump will do and how this will all shake out. But one thing that we can be sure of is that whatever happens in the near term, we should expect Vladimir Putin to come out of the whole thing unbroken and actually even stronger. And the reason we can be sure of that is because of what Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Fleury has said about Putin's role in a future Asian alliance. There are multiple Bible passages that discuss this huge end-time alliance of Asian nations. You can read about it in the books of Daniel and Joel and Revelation. And then there's a lengthy passage about it in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Those chapters are largely about an individual called the Prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And Mr. Fleury has said for more than 10 years now that these three names refer to Russia and two of its important cities, and he has maintained that this passage is describing Vladimir Putin. He goes through the details of all of that in his booklet, The Prophesied Prince of Russia, and it shows that Putin's most important days and his most important battles and wars are still ahead for him. So however things may go with this ceasefire and with other near-term developments, we should expect Putin to come out of it all unbroken and even strengthened. And for anyone who would like to learn more about the details of all that, I hope that you'll go to thetrumpet.com and order your free copy of The Prophesied Prince of Russia. And then we've also got a couple of smaller stories about Asia this week. First, Russia has just announced that it'll be conducting a major set of naval war games later this month alongside the navies of China and Iran. These will be in the Gulf of Oman, and they'll be focusing on practicing striking maritime targets especially. And this is actually the fifth time that Russia, China, and Iran have held joint naval exercises since 2019. So it is a regular occurrence now, but that doesn't mean that it isn't significant to see these powers, all of whom long for the destruction of the US-led global order, practicing together for the time when they decide to take action toward that end. And then one final story here about China. A fascinating Wall Street Journal article was published this week showing that China is using gray zone strategies to gradually expand its borders in basically every direction. These are not new revelations, but it is very powerful to see them all laid out together in this analysis. It details the way China is slowly pushing into Bhutan and India. They start by sending just herders across the borders to graze their animals inside of India and Bhutan, and then they build small shelters eventually. Then they upgrade those shelters to official outposts, and then they begin sending some soldiers in. Then they build roads that link these outposts to China, and then they build little villages along the roads, and they order Chinese people to move there and live there. And then finally the Chinese start saying that it has always been Chinese land. So it takes several years, even decades, but it is expanding China's borders little by little. And the article shows how this is similar to what China has done in the South China Sea. First building artificial islands there, and then militarizing those islands and turning them into bases from which Chinese warships can bully other vessels in the area. The Chinese do all this very gradually, very slowly with this gray zone strategy, and it is remarkable to see just how effective their persistence with this is.
On Tuesday, the Israeli and Lebanese militaries held a conference in Nakura, a city in southern Lebanon where the United Nations maintains an office. And the talks centered around taking the current de facto border between Israel and Lebanon, the current ceasefire line, and converting it with some tweaks into an actual official border. Israel and Lebanon don't have relations with each other and have been fighting wars on and off certainly since the 1970s, whether the Lebanese state itself or terror groups in Lebanon. As of last year, Israel had invaded Lebanon to fight the terror group Hezbollah that was bombarding Israel's north. And so if these talks are successful, that could be a notable change in direction with relations with Israel and Lebanon. In 2022, the two countries had already negotiated a maritime border under United States President Joe Biden's brokerage. These current talks are a project of the Trump administration. But even though if this were to go ahead, if the talks are to be fruitful, that would be a significant step in and of itself. Israeli media suggests that this is building towards something bigger. An anonymous Israeli official told the Israeli medium N12, quote, "Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's policy has already changed the Middle East, and we want to continue the momentum and reach normalization with Lebanon," end quote. If this all continues, this may mean a peace treaty between Israel and Lebanon. This may mean them treating each other like normal countries, them allowing each other's citizens to come and visit, them allowing planes from their countries to land in, them not boycotting each other in international forums. This, if it were to go ahead, could be the biggest change in Israel's geopolitical situation since 1978 when they signed their peace treaty with Israel. Now, we have to ask, what's changing now? Lebanon, or often groups in Lebanon, have been warring against Israel for decades, in some cases even opposing Israel's right to exist. Why the sudden 180 turn? Well, of course, the latest round of violence was last autumn when Israel invaded southern Lebanon against the Hezbollah terror group that had been bombarding Israel's north for about a year. Hezbollah, of course, has until recently been the biggest militant group, terror group, political party, whatever you want to call them, in Lebanon. They had stores of munitions of about 150,000 projectiles, including precision-guided missiles, tens of thousands of soldiers. They had billions of dollars worth of funding over the years from Iran. And even the IDF on their website called Hezbollah Israel's most complicated adversary. And Israel was able to go in and dismantle most of Hezbollah's military infrastructure there in Lebanon's south, neutralized most of that arsenal of rockets and missiles and other projectiles. They killed Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's longtime leader, one of the terrorists around the world with most blood on his hands. They've gutted most of Hezbollah's other leadership, including a lot of their military commanders. There wasn't really anybody left in Hezbollah to give orders. Hezbollah is a Shiite group. They're sponsored by Iran and have been for years. And this basically, for all intents and purposes, ended the Iranian project in Lebanon. Since then, some of the elements of the civilian government have been able to get under control. Since the end of 2022, Lebanon hasn't had a functioning head of state. They haven't been able to elect a president because Hezbollah, their members of parliament, were able to stonewall putting anybody in there that they didn't agree with. That is changed now. Joseph Aoun, the former commander of the Lebanese armed forces, the parliament voted him in, even though Hezbollah didn't approve of the move. He's been able to put together a more anti-Hezbollah government. In his first speech to the Lebanese parliament, he said that he intends to disarm Hezbollah, and that got the largest standing ovation of the speech. You could see that the Lebanese government is, or at least the civilian government, is getting extremely tired of Hezbollah's leadership, of Hezbollah selling the country to Iran, of Hezbollah bringing Lebanon into foreign wars it didn't want to sign up with. And the very fact that news is able to break out about this and we're not seeing chaos erupt all over the Middle East says something with what the Lebanese government and a lot of the Lebanese people are thinking. In 2023, there were rumblings that Israel was working on a normalization agreement with Libya, the country on the North African coast. And things were inching slowly but surely, but the Israeli foreign minister, Eli Cohen, he publicly announced it, apparently impromptu, without telling Netanyahu what he was going to do if it was happening. The Libyan government wasn't prepared for this. They denied that there was any deal going on. The Libyan foreign minister was sacked and had to flee the country. And you're not seeing anything like that with these rumblings about Lebanon. So some positive signs, perhaps. It's important also to include that this initiative apparently, though, did not come from either Israel or Lebanon, but rather from the United States. According to a report on Axios, President Donald Trump is pushing for this, and this is, quote, intended to help stabilize the ceasefire brokered by the Biden administration last November, end quote. So President Trump is taking the agreement that Biden made a few months back, right before he left office, and is trying to build on it, perhaps even to bring a peace deal in with Lebanon. Now, of course, President Trump is no stranger to this. In his first term, he negotiated 4 normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And looks like he may be trying to build on this. The Israeli government said before was clear Mr. Trump wasn't staying after January 2021 that there would be more deals coming. That never happened. Looks like both Trump and Netanyahu want to continue where they left off from. And again, if this were to go ahead, this is not the same thing as, say, a country like Bahrain that has never warred with Israel. It's on the other side of the Middle East, or Morocco in their case. They've had friendly relations with Israel under the table for decades. This would be converting one of Israel's most constant perennial enemies into a friend. So does that mean that we're going to have Camp David Accords 2.0 with Lebanon, with a Hezbollah-less Lebanon coming? So the Lebanese government, which, again, this is following the war, they owe their existence right now to Israel. They would not be in power right now, the people in power, if it weren't for Israel doing what it did to Hezbollah. They may want peace, but do the Lebanese people? And even if Lebanon as a whole, even if the Lebanese people do want peace today, when they're poor, when they need help from the international community, when they've been whipped by the IDF, does that mean they're going to want peace tomorrow? Well, after the agreements with the UAE and these other countries happened, our editor-in-chief, Mr. Joe Fleury, wrote an article that appeared in our January 2021 print edition about those peace accords, the Abraham Accords. Quote, "We all want peace, but sadly, these recent peace pacts have a deadly flaw. Biblical prophecy gives us deep insight into these agreements. It actually foretells that modern Arabs will unite somewhat like we are now seeing. But they are prophesied not to cooperate with the United States or Israel. A prophecy in Psalm 83 exposes a hidden reality behind these peace deals. We are already in the beginning stages of its fulfillment," end quote. Now, what hidden reality is Mr. Fleury talking about that? We'll go there. We'll look at Psalm 83. This is about a coalition of different Middle Eastern peoples coming together against God, against his purposes, against his people. Verse 4 says that they do that so that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. And the particular peoples that make up this alliance, verses 6 through 8, to go through them: the tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asser also is joined with them. Those are a lot of names. It might be hard to know what relevance this has for today unless you know what the modern descendants of these people are. This is a list Mr. Fleury provides in his free book, The King of the South, on who all these people are. It says that the Ishmaelites are Saudi Arabia, Moab and Ammon, both refer to Jordan. The Hagarenes anciently dwelled in the land known as Syria today. The Philistines are the modern Palestinian Arabs, and this is a key point. Gebal and Tyre are Lebanon. So Lebanon is going to be involved in this alliance. And, is Gebal or Byblos another name for it historically? Tyre. Those are still cities in Lebanon today. Tyre is in the far south. Byblos is in the far north. Like the whole country. Mr. Fleury continued in his Deadly Flaw article, again talking about the previous peace agreements. Quote, "While it seems that these nations are moving away from radicalism and violence, we must look beneath the surface. After all, this prophecy reveals that they will take crafty counsel, subtle and shrewd dealings. This prophecy shows that these nations will ally to try to blot out the name of Israel forever. That is intense hatred," end quote. And he wrote that about the UAE and the Bahrain, some of these more sophisticated modern Arab countries. They've never really been historically Israel's enemy. Lebanon has. Lebanon often has been among Israel's worst enemies. So what Mr. Fleury wrote for these other countries, you could say, applies way, way more to Lebanon, to, again, what the IDF recently called Israel's most complicated adversary, or at least Hezbollah. You could look at the rest of the prophecy and the book The King of the South, and it shows that Europe is going to be involved in this as well, in building this alliance. Asser is a prophetic name for modern Germany. And we're even seeing this current Lebanese government gravitate more towards Europe. Not long after Aoun became Lebanon's president, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, he came to visit him. The Vatican's had a lot to say about what's going on in Lebanon and how they support the process. So even that aspect is coming together as well. So whatever happens, don't expect Lebanon to stay Israel's friend, even if they do sign a peace treaty, even if we do get the optics of a Camp David 2.0. You could expect Lebanon to contribute to, instead, with these other countries, with the Psalm 83 alliance, the worst attack in Israel's history. If you'd like to learn more about that, Mr. Fleur's article is Deadly Flaw in Mideast Peace Deals. And that could give a bit more context as to what we're expecting with these dealings Israel's making with some countries in the Arab world. So that's the main story I wanted to cover. There's a couple of smaller ones that I'd like to tie in. This one comes in from, it started last week, but it's continuing in today. It's more unrest in Syria. Maybe there's a new sheriff in Damascus. That doesn't mean the rest of the country is ready to accept the new government. And there have been several militias forming against the HTS-led government, mainly from Assad loyalists, concentrated along the coastlands of Syria, around Latakia and Tartus and some of these coastal cities, again, trying to overthrow the government. And HTS and some of their Sunni Islamists associated with them, they've staged counterattacks. They've gone after these militias, but they've also gone after some of their supporters, or at least alleged supporters. The Assad family, they came from a group called the Alawites. That's a derivative of Islam, sort of related to Shia Islam. The Sunni Islams consider them heretics, or not even Muslim to begin with. And HTS and their allies have been doing revenge killings in Alawite villages, targeting Christians as well. Last time I checked, over 1,200 people have died between the skirmishes of these Assad loyalist militias and the Sunni Islamists, and the vast majority of them are civilians from these Alawite villages at the hands of the Islamists. The leader of HTS, Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, he claimed not to approve of this, and there have been a few court cases for some people of extrajudicial killings. There haven't been that many, as far as I know. This may purely be cosmetic to keep his image of a reformer up. But you think about everything happening in Syria. This is the man that Europe has been dealing with in reconstructing Syria. This is the man that Europe is showing that this is Syria's future. This is how we're going to put the country back together. We mentioned the Hagarenes in the Psalm 83 prophecy, the ancient Syrians. They're prophesied to be in this alliance as well. They're prophesied to come together to Europe, supporting a terror group like HTS, especially when they're massacring religious communities like this. That doesn't look good for Europe. How they're going to respond to this remains to be seen, but it's certainly going to be something that they have to factor in, and one way or another, whether they keep supporting HTS, whether they find a different group to hide behind, we'll see, but it's either way, this is an important development to follow. One other story, the United Nations Human Rights Council has recently accused Israel of genocide because it's bombing what they call women's healthcare facilities. Their words, imposing measures intended to prevent births. In other words, because Israel hits a hospital in Gaza, that means they're trying to stop Palestinians from having babies, and that counts as genocide. In a place like Gaza that's so densely populated, I mean, of course, some of this infrastructure is going to get hit. And as we've covered on the trumpet before, a lot of these civilian infrastructures, these hospitals, these schools, these playgrounds are used by Hamas as weapons depots, are used to store weapons. And they do that because they know if Israel hits them, then they'll be able to go in front of the press, go in front of the international cameras, and make Israel look out to be a monster, even though Israel has no other choice if they want to protect their people. And for the UN to be claiming this kind of justification for accusing Israel of genocide is just absolutely ludicrous. Especially when you consider that the United Nations, through some of their programs, through UNRWA, through some of these other institutions, have actually helped create the situation in Gaza in the first place. If you'd like to learn more about that, we had an article from last year called Hamas Made in the United Nations that can show you the full story.
Well, that's the end of another slightly out of the ordinary Trumpet World. Thank you so much to all of our contributors for sending in their videos. Thank you to George Haddad and Victor Granados for engineering and production. Thank you so much to you, the viewer, for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, you can get in touch at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. Feel free to leave any comments or to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching this video, Rumble, YouTube, etc. I'll be back in the UK most probably for our Wednesday show, though I've got a few more shows that I recorded while in Canada that we will put up over the coming few months, so you can keep an eye out for them. And until then, keep watching your world.